It was supposed to be a routine Tuesday morning, the kind of morning you forget by lunchtime. A soft fog rolled in from the bay, painting everything in shades of gray. The courthouse sat like a forgotten bunker near the docks, its walls stained by years of salt air and exhaust fumes. Inside, a clerk fought off sleep behind a desk too small for the piles of paperwork in front of her. A janitor dragged a mop across the tile floor. No one expected anything more dramatic than a heated parking dispute. Then came the woman in the black hoodie. Her name was Sarah Dalton. She was 42, lean and quiet, with brown hair tied in a no-nonsense ponytail and green eyes that had seen more than they should have. She drove an old, dented Honda Civic that wheezed into the visitor parking lot like it, too, was tired of being part of the system. Her jeans were worn thin, her sneakers scuffed to the soles. No makeup, no jewelry, just a thick manila envelope under one arm and a determined silence around her. To the people watching from the courthouse steps, she looked like someone dealing with unpaid bills or a zoning dispute. Maybe a traffic ticket she'd forgotten to handle. Nothing worth remembering, and that was the point. She wanted to be forgettable. Sarah had already made 3 separate trips to government offices in the last 2 months. The VA regional office in Oakland had flagged her new mailing address. That had triggered a routine housing status review, which then required fresh documentation, which somehow led to a missed court date she'd never been notified about. And now, here she was again, trying to make the system recognize she existed. She didn't come here to make noise. She came to get her papers stamped, pay whatever fine they wanted, and go back to her life in a converted shipping container on the outskirts of Marina. Rent was cheap there, $200 a month. It was quiet. Nobody asked questions. That's all she really needed these days, silence and space. But the courthouse wasn't interested in quiet. As she stepped into the fluorescent, lit lobby, the smell of burnt coffee and disinfectant hit her like a wall. The walls were plastered with flyers no one read. The buzz of an old overhead light added a low drone to the air. She approached the counter and handed her envelope to a woman whose name tag read, Mrs. Howard. The clerk glanced up with tired eyes and an expression that had long since learned to stop caring. "What can I help you with?" she asked, more reflex than invitation. "I'm here about the Dalton case. VA documentation review," Sarah said calmly. Howard tapped a few keys, then frowned. "You missed a court date. There's a bench warrant out." "I was never notified," Sarah replied, her voice flat. "Says you were served at your listed address." Sarah didn't argue. What would be the point? Then the bailiff showed up. Sergeant Mike Kowalski, built like a linebacker, uniform stretched tight, swagger dialed up to 10. "Sarah Dalton," he barked, loud enough for heads to turn. "You're coming with me. I'm just here to file paperwork. You can file it from lockup. Hands out." And that was it. She could have explained. She could have told them about the paperwork, the 3-hour drive, the mess at the VA. But she didn't. She simply turned around and extended her wrists. The cuffs clicked into place with a sound that made the room go still. A young mother pulled her child a little closer. A man in a rumpled suit muttered, "That system eats people alive." No one looked at Sarah the same way now. "A parking citation," Kowalski announced to the lobby. "Thinks she's too good for the rules." As he escorted her toward the courtroom, he kept talking. Partly to her, mostly for show. "You know your problem. You people think the rules don't apply. I got a nephew in the Marines. He's got more respect than this." Sarah said nothing. The courtroom was just as stale and colorless as the rest of the building. Judge Harold Brenner presided, silver-haired, tired, his glasses always halfway down his nose. He barely looked up as Kowalski read the charge of failure to appear for a parking violation. Fine, $240 plus court costs. Recommendation: hold until payment. "Mom, you're remanded to county custody," the judge ruled. His gavel came down like a final breath. Then, as Kowalski moved to lead her out, it happened. The handcuffs pulled at Sarah's sleeves, revealing the inside of her left forearm. 9 short lines, evenly spaced, burned, not tattooed, into her skin. Each mark precise, deliberate, not decorative, not accidental. They looked like kill counts, because they were. In the back of the courtroom, a Navy JAG officer named Commander Patricia Wells froze mid-conversation. She had worked in intelligence before law school. She'd seen those marks before, in secret briefings, in files that didn't technically exist. Her face turned pale. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That's Overwatch protocol. Confirmed kills from over 800 yards. That's not just some veteran." Beside her, Lieutenant Mark Jefferson looked up from his notes. "Are you sure?" Wells didn't answer. She was already reaching for her phone. Sarah Dalton, the woman handcuffed over a parking ticket, wasn't just a forgotten veteran. She was Overwatch 7. A SEAL sniper thought killed in action during Operation Copper Rain in Yemen. Her mission had been classified, her file sealed, her medals awarded in silence. And somehow she was standing here, quiet, tired, forgotten, and being treated like a criminal by people who had no idea what she had done. And this was only the beginning. Sarah Dalton had learned long ago that silence was safer than argument. She stood still as the bailiff tightened the cuffs around her wrists. Cool steel pressing into skin that had once held a rifle steady in 120-degree heat halfway across the world. The lobby noise dulled into a quiet murmur, broken only by the squeak of rubber soles against the floor as Sergeant Kowalski guided her past rows of plastic chairs and government posters. "Failure to appear," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some folks think the rules just don't apply to them." She could have said something. She could have told him about the letter that never came, the address change the VA still hadn't processed, about the 3-hour drive she'd made that morning from the edge of Monterey Bay just to clear this up. But none of it would have mattered. In places like this, once the system labels you a problem, the truth becomes irrelevant. 2 weeks earlier, Sarah had moved from a cramped motel room to a shipping container that had been converted into makeshift housing by an old Navy buddy. It wasn't much, just a bed, a lamp, a coffee pot, and a view of the dunes. But it was quiet. And after years of noise, quiet was more valuable than space. But the VA didn't recognize the new address. That kicked off a review of her disability status, which delayed her housing assistance, which froze her benefits, which flagged her file. And somewhere in that chain of administrative confusion, a traffic citation was issued and a court summons supposedly delivered, only she never received it. So now, here she was. A woman who once called air support under fire in Helmand was being marched through a courthouse for missing a parking ticket hearing she never knew about. Mrs. Howard, the clerk at the front desk, had barely glanced at Sarah before calling the bailiff. Her fingers had flown over the keyboard, pulling up her file with a cold efficiency. "Bench warrants active," she'd said. "You'll need to speak with court security. No questions asked. No second look. Just a click of keys and a nod to the man in uniform." When Kowalski barked her name, heads turned. He seemed to enjoy the attention, like a sheriff in an old western. Sarah didn't flinch, didn't roll her eyes or raise her voice. She simply complied, lowering her head slightly as if trying to vanish behind her hoodie. "Hands out," he ordered. She extended them without a word. The cuffs locked tight. The sound, sharp, metallic, rippled through the lobby. A young couple waiting at the family court window stopped talking. An older man lowered his newspaper. A security guard stepped forward instinctively, only to realize it wasn't a threat. Just another arrest. Just another woman brought in for refusing to follow the rules. Except she hadn't refused anything. She'd tried everything. 3 separate phone calls to the VA. 2 hours on hold. One clerk had told her the documentation would be updated in 7 to 10 business days. Another said she should come in person, which is exactly what she did. Today, in fact. She had the entire paper trail in the envelope tucked beneath her arm. She even had the receipt from the DMV office that proved she'd updated her vehicle registration, just in case the citation was connected to that. None of it mattered now. "Let's go," Kowalski snapped, tugging her arm. As they made their way down the hallway toward the holding area, the courthouse felt colder, narrower. The floors gleamed with government polish. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered just enough to make her headache worse. "You people?" Kowalski muttered again, more to himself than to her. "Always got an excuse. Disability this, but you miss court, you miss court." Simple. Sarah said nothing, not because she agreed, but because she'd learned long ago that there are fights worth picking. And this wasn't one of them. They passed a bulletin board littered with faded flyers. Know your rights. Veteran services available here. Report abuse. Sarah allowed herself the smallest smile. She could have written better briefings on a napkin. When they reached the courtroom, Judge Harold Brenner barely looked up from his stack of files. Name, he asked. Oh, Sarah. Kowalski answered. Case 1987B, failure to appear. Parking Ordinance 15.7. Fine is 240 plus court costs. Remand to holding. He banged the gavel like it was a routine decision. And to him it was. Sarah was still cuffed, still silent, as she was led from the room. The legal machinery kept turning. Other defendants shifted in their seats. Lawyers whispered to clients. The clerk called the next case. But something had changed. Because when her sleeves slid back slightly during the shuffle, a few people in that courtroom noticed the marks on her forearm, just for a second. They were small, barely visible, but deliberate. 9 parallel lines. Burned, not tattooed. One of them, Commander Patricia Wells, went still in her seat. Sarah Dalton, the woman no one bothered to ask about, was now the quiet center of a brewing storm. And the system that had cuffed her without question was about to learn exactly who it had locked up. But for now, Sarah sat on the courthouse bench in holding, her hands folded calmly, her back straight, her sleeve rolled up just enough to let the past breathe. No anger, no complaint, just patience. Because some people don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes, the silence is the warning. The hallway to holding was silent except for the low shuffle of boots and the mechanical whir of overhead lights. Sergeant Kowalski still had his hand wrapped around Sarah Dalton's arm, guiding her like she might bolt, though everything about her body said the opposite. She walked with calm restraint, no resistance, no shame. Just a quiet purpose honed over years of obeying orders no one outside classified briefings ever read. He kept muttering as they passed a row of courtrooms. This is what happens when you think you're above the system. Miss a date, get a warrant. It ain't complicated. Sarah didn't even blink. She'd heard worse from better men. As they turned a corner, her cuffed wrists pulled her sleeves upward, just a couple of inches. That's all it took. 9 parallel marks, etched like code, were suddenly visible along the inside of her left forearm. They were dark and clean, almost too precise to be scars, yet too deliberate to be decorative. Not tattoos, not accidental. They looked like tally marks, short 1-inch lines spaced exactly a 1/4 inch apart. But they weren't counting days, they were counting lives. In courtroom 2B, a Navy JAG officer in the back row happened to look up. Commander Patricia Wells, early 40s, crisp uniform, chest full of commendations, was scanning documents when her eye caught the flicker of Sarah's arm just as the cuffs shifted. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Then her posture stiffened. Her file dropped to her lap. Her voice came out in a whisper so low that only her colleague beside her heard. Oh my God. Lieutenant Mark Jefferson, sitting next to her, frowned. What? She leaned forward. Those marks on her arm. Those are Overwatch tallies. Confirmed long-distance kills. Her voice had the unmistakable edge of someone whose training had just overridden everything else in her brain. Jefferson blinked. Are you sure? They're not just, I don't know, old scars. No, she snapped. They're not decorative. They're protocol. Not officially sanctioned, but known. I've seen them in black briefings. SEAL Tier 1 stuff. Off-book snipers. Overwatch units. We had one in Yemen. Call sign was Overwatch 7. He looked at her. But those ops were years ago. Most of the Overwatch snipers were never even declassified. Half of them are presumed KIA. She was one of them, Wells said. At least, I thought she was. From the gallery, she stood up, staring across the courtroom toward the woman in cuffs. Her eyes locked on Sarah's arm as the bailiff moved her toward the side exit. The marks were clearer now in the courtroom light. 9 short lines, burned into her skin with military precision. 9 confirmed kills from distances beyond 800 yards. Sarah Dalton wasn't some neglected veteran with a forgotten court date. She was a ghost from the deepest shadows of military intelligence. The courtroom continued to move around them, the judge calling names, clerks typing, lawyers whispering. But in that small back row, a pocket of silence had formed. Wells was already pulling out her phone, bypassing standard channels and opening a secure portal. She tapped in a clearance code, level 7. then searched the name she never thought she'd type again. Overwatch 7. The result flashed across her screen. Dalton, Sarah J., U.S. Navy, Tier 1 operator, Overwatch program, status killed in action, March 2012, Morab Province, Yemen. Citation. Navy Cross, classified. Commander Wells's heart stopped. She looked up. Sarah Dalton, declared dead, buried in a file locked behind layers of red tape and silence, was standing 20 feet away, handcuffed for a traffic violation and being led to holding like a petty offender. She turned to Jefferson. She was listed as KIA. A building collapse. She was last seen holding the rooftop position during Copper Rain. That mission. Jefferson's face turned serious. That mission doesn't even officially exist. Wells nodded. And that's why no one here knows who she is. But she knew. She'd written the after-action report. Sarah had stayed on the radio 18 hours after the building went down. Crushed ribs, punctured lung, broken spine, and she still called out enemy positions, coordinating extraction while buried in rubble. The voice on the line that day had saved 43 American lives. Now, that same voice was being silenced in a county courthouse over a Tudor 40 citation. Wells moved without thinking. She left the gallery and stepped into the hallway, phone still in hand. She called an old number, a line that hadn't rung in years. It answered on the first try. "This is Commander Patricia Wells. I need to speak with Rear Admiral Benjamin Thorne. Immediate." "It's about Overwatch 7. There was a pause on the other end, then a single response. "Is on his way." Back in the holding area, Sarah sat on the wooden bench, uncuffed now, hands folded in her lap. She didn't pull her sleeve down. Didn't try to hide the marks. If they'd been noticed, so be it. This wasn't the first time the past had come calling, and it wouldn't be the last. But something had shifted. Somewhere in the building, someone remembered. Someone saw what others didn't, and that meant something was coming. Sarah remained still. She'd survived far worse than bureaucracy. She'd survived the collapse of a 6-story building. She'd survived enemies with thermal scopes and kill orders. And now, she'd survived this too. In the distance, the main courthouse doors opened with a sound like thunder. Someone was about to answer for what had been forgotten. And Sarah Dalton, Overwatch 7, was no longer invisible. Commander Patricia Wells had seen a lot during her time in naval intelligence. Deception, disinformation, entire operations wiped from the books like they never happened. But nothing, not even her classified training, prepared her for what was unfolding right in front of her eyes. She stood frozen in the courthouse hallway, the last few keystrokes still glowing on her phone screen. Status, KIA 2012. Morab Province, Yemen. Except the woman listed as killed in action was sitting just 20 feet away on a holding bench, calmly watching the dull green light overhead flicker against the wall, not fidgeting, not panicked, just waiting, like she had before. Like she always did. Wells's fingers trembled slightly as she enlarged the file. Name Sarah J. Dalton, call sign Overwatch 7, assignment tier 1, sniper, U.S. Naval Special Warfare Award. Navy Cross, classified. Final report, presumed deceased during Operation Copper Rain. Copper Rain. That name alone was enough to still her breath. It was one of those black missions, so far off the books that even confirming its existence could cost a career. Wells remembered it vividly, a SEAL team trapped in a hostile city center, under constant enemy fire, with no air support, no ground evac route. Their only hope, a single sniper positioned on a rooftop 6 stories high, tasked with watching 3 extraction points at once. That sniper was Sarah Dalton. Wells had written the post-mission summary herself. Well, the redacted one. The real report never made it out of the server room. According to official records, the building collapsed after an RPG strike. Radio contact was lost. Dalton was presumed dead after 18 hours buried under concrete and steel. But the final radio transmission, Wells remembered it word for word. Extraction point Bravo still hot. East Alley is your best route. I'll stay on until you're out. And she did stay on, despite a collapsed lung. Despite the rebar that had gone through her shoulder, despite being trapped beneath 2 floors of broken brick and dust, she stayed. She talked every last man through the escape, 43 lives, with a radio duct taped together and a voice that never cracked. And then she disappeared. No debrief, no memorial, no honors ceremony, just a quietly sealed file and a note that read, "Service concluded, classified." Until today. Wells looked up again, now seeing clearly what others hadn't. The quiet demeanor, the minimal movements, the 1,000-yard calm of someone who'd learned not to flinch. The 9 hash marks on her arm, the envelope still clutched under one elbow like just another errand on her to-do list. This woman wasn't just another forgotten veteran tangled in red tape. She was a legend, buried by bureaucracy and reborn as a ghost. And yet, no one here knew. She'd been cuffed like a criminal, paraded through the building for a 240 citation, spoken to like a delinquent, mistreated by a system that didn't even ask her name properly. Wells felt a wave of cold shame. She stepped away from the wall and spoke into her phone in a low, measured tone. "I need Rear Admiral Thorne. Now tell him it's about Overwatch 7. Immediate eyes only." There was a pause on the other end. "Commander, Overwatch 7 is key IA. She's sitting in a holding cell in Alameda County right now. Alive, unacknowledged, and being processed like a shoplifter." A sharp inhale from the other end. "Understood. We're en route." Wells ended the call and looked across the lobby again. Court staff milled about, oblivious. The judge continued reading dockets. The bailiff who had cuffed Sarah now leaned against a wall, scrolling his phone like it had all been just another routine morning. None of them knew who was in the next room. Wells turned back to Lieutenant Jefferson. "We need to brief the judge. Now." He blinked. "You think he'll believe it? He won't have to. Rear Admiral Thorne will be here in less than an hour. And when he walks in, no one in this building is going to forget this day." She took a breath and squared her shoulders. "You don't lose Overwatch 7 in the paperwork and walk away from it." Back in the holding area, Sarah sat quietly, arms resting on her knees. Her forearm, with its silent tally of 9, was still exposed. She hadn't bothered to pull the sleeve down. What would be the point? Those marks weren't meant for anyone here to understand. They were for the men who never made it back, for the calls she answered when no one else could, for the part of herself that never quite returned from that rooftop. She knew someone had seen them. The woman in the gallery. The way her eyes widened, the way her hand went for the phone. Sarah recognized the shift. It had begun. She didn't need confirmation, just time. Because if there was one thing Sarah Dalton knew how to do, it was to wait. Wait for the shot, wait for the call. Wait for the storm that always came after the silence. The sound of the courthouse doors swinging open didn't just interrupt the ambient chatter. It silenced it completely. A wave of stillness rippled through the lobby as every head turned toward the entrance. And there he was. Rear Admiral Benjamin Thorne strode in like a thunderclap wrapped in white. Tall, broad-shouldered, in full-dress uniform so crisp it looked as though it had been pressed seconds ago. Rows of ribbons and medals shimmered across his chest. 2 bronze stars, a purple heart, and a navy cross among them. He didn't walk so much as command the space around him. Every step exuded the kind of authority forged not in meetings, but in fire. Behind him followed 2 junior officers, one carrying a locked briefcase, the other gripping a secure comms device that had been buzzing since they left Coronado. But all eyes were on Thorne. Even the security guards straightened as he passed, unsure why someone of his rank had entered a municipal courthouse, but instinctively aware that something was about to change. At the information desk, Mrs. Howard's voice caught in her throat. She actually stood, something she hadn't done for anyone since a federal judge visited 5 years prior. "I need to speak to whoever is holding Sarah Dalton," Thorne said, his voice deep, clear, and sharp as a blade. "Why?" "Yes, sir. She's in hearing holding, just down the hall," Mrs. Howard stammered, her hands moving across the keyboard, like a pianist suddenly afraid of hitting the wrong note. "I don't care what she's pending. I need to see her. Now." There was no argument, no clarification, just a gesture toward the hall. Thorne was already moving before she finished. When he reached the holding area, he found Sarah exactly where he expected, seated on the bench, hands resting in her lap, posture still and composed. She looked up at the sound of his boots on tile and rose to her feet. She didn't salute. She didn't snap to attention. But her spine straightened, her shoulders pulled back, and for a moment the years fell away. "Admiral," she said softly. "Sarah." His voice lost none of its weight, but there was a current of something deeper beneath it now. Recognition, sorrow, perhaps even guilt. They told me you were dead? I was supposed to be. Their eyes met. For a second, neither spoke. There was nothing performative about the moment. No theatrics, no speeches. Just two soldiers who had survived things others couldn't imagine, finally standing face to face again. Then Thorne turned, facing the crowd that had gathered behind him, court staff, junior officers, and Judge Harold Brenner, who had emerged from his courtroom, confused by the sudden halt in proceedings. "Does anyone here," Thorne said, voice rising to fill the hall, "have the slightest idea who this woman is?" The silence that followed was total. "She's the sniper who held overwatch during Operation Copper Rain, Morab Province, 2012. She was positioned atop a 6-story building with direct line of sight to 3 extraction points. When that building took a direct RPG hit, it collapsed beneath her." He paused, scanning the room. Everyone was listening now, every breath, every glance frozen. "We found her 18 hours later," he continued, "buried beneath rubble, ribs broken, a collapsed lung, rebar through her shoulder. Yet she was still alive, still on comms, still guiding her team through enemy lines." He pointed toward the far end of the hallway, where a faded American flag hung in a dusty frame. She stayed on frequency, duct taping a shattered radio together with her own bleeding hands, because 43 American servicemen were depending on her voice to get out alive. Gasps echoed from the gallery. A young clerk dropped his pen. One of the public defenders took off his glasses, stunned. Even Judge Brenner looked stricken. "She saved every last one of them," Thorne said. "And then she disappeared. Her service was classified. Her medals were sealed, her name buried in a file that only 3 people in Washington were ever cleared to read." His voice dropped a note, not in volume, but in gravity. "And now, you handcuff her over a parking ticket. You processed her like a nuisance. You called her a no-show and didn't think to ask why." Kowalski, the bailiff who'd led Sarah through the building like she was common property, stood frozen in place, his face drained of color. His hands hung limp at his sides. "I understand she missed a court date," Thorne said, locking eyes with Judge Brenner. "But you had every tool at your disposal to ask who she was before dragging her through the mud." Brenner swallowed hard. "Admiral, we didn't know. That's the problem," Thorne replied. "Nobody ever asks. Nobody ever stops to consider that the quietest person in the room may have held the weight of a nation on their back." He turned back to Sarah, his face softening. "And yet here she is, alive, not asking for medals, not demanding recognition, just trying to file VA paperwork and get back to whatever piece of peace she's built for herself." Sarah met his gaze but said nothing. She didn't need to. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped inside the Alameda County Courthouse. Rear Admiral Benjamin Thorne's words still hung in the air like thunder after a flash of lightning. The courtroom, once a hive of disinterest and bureaucracy, was now dead silent. Not a paper rustled. Not a breath dared break the weight pressing down on the room. Eyes that once barely glanced at Sarah Dalton now stared at her like she'd been resurrected from the pages of a classified legend. And in a way she had. Thorne turned to Judge Harold Brenner, whose posture had subtly shifted from stern and indifferent to something far more unsettled. The color in his cheeks had drained. He looked smaller now, dwarfed not by Thorne's rank, but by the truth unraveling in front of him. "Admiral," the judge said, his voice measured but uncertain, "we had no way of knowing. Her name was entered as a civilian. There was no military flag on her record." Thorne raised a hand, not to threaten, but to cut off the well-worn excuse. "You had every way of knowing, Your Honor. It's called asking. It's called treating people with dignity before defaulting to assumption. If anyone had spoken to her, truly spoken to her, even for 30 seconds, you'd have known she wasn't just here to waste the court's time." He let the silence hang for a beat. "But you didn't. You treated her like a file number, a problem, a tick on a docket to clear before lunch." Brenner looked down, avoiding Thorne's gaze. Across the room, Sergeant Kowalski, the bailiff who'd handcuffed Sarah in the lobby with performative confidence, stood motionless, his jaw clenched. The bravado that carried him earlier had evaporated, leaving behind a pale face and the unmistakable sting of public disgrace. Thorne slowly turned his attention to him. You put cuffs on a Navy Cross recipient, a woman who saved 43 American lives from a pile of rubble most people wouldn't have survived 10 minutes in. You marched her past a dozen people without so much as a question. You mocked her service, and then had the gall to lecture her about respect for authority. His voice was calm even. That made it worse. Kowalski started to speak, but the words collapsed before they could leave his throat. You didn't know. Thorne continued. I believe that. But that's not an excuse. That's the problem. Then the Admiral turned back toward Brenner. I'm calling for an immediate dismissal of all charges, all fines, and the complete erasure of today's proceedings from her record. I want every fingerprint, every citation, every digital trace of this day removed by close of business. Is that understood? The judge nodded without protest. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Consider it done. And Judge? Thorne stepped closer, his voice now low and unmistakably final. The next time someone walks into your courtroom, I suggest you ask yourself one question before you decide what they're worth. Do I know their story? Because what happened here today, what almost happened, wasn't just a clerical failure. It was a moral one. He didn't wait for a reply. Behind him, the gathered courtroom staff, clerks, and junior officers remained silent. Some looked ashamed, others stunned. A few looked at Sarah with something close to awe. But none of them spoke, none of them could. Sarah herself hadn't moved. She stood near the bench where she'd been held, her manila envelope still tucked beneath one arm. She wasn't crying. She wasn't smiling either. Her face wore the same quiet expression she'd walked in with. As if none of this surprised her. Because it didn't. She had seen systems fail. She had seen heroes buried under silence, medals handed out behind closed doors, stories erased in the name of national security. So no, this didn't shock her. It hurt, sure, but it didn't surprise her. Still, something in her eyes softened when Thorne turned back to her. Sarah, he said, voice gentler now. Is there anything you need? She shook her head slightly. No, sir. I just came to file my paperwork. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Then, slowly and deliberately, everyone else in that courtroom followed his lead. Clerks stood straighter. A defense attorney lowered his head in respect. Even Judge Brenner took a breath, stood up fully behind the bench, and gave a small nod, not out of formality, but out of understanding. Sarah walked past them all, back down the corridor, sleeves down now, envelope tucked close. No fanfare, no applause, just the echo of her footsteps on tile, measured, calm, steady. A rhythm forged from years of carrying burdens others never saw. At the front door, a young court clerk, barely 25, hurried after her and held out a small card. My mom works for the VA, he stammered, nervously. She said if you ever need help with anything to call her. And she said thank you. Sarah took the card, tucked it into her jacket, and offered a soft thank you. Then she stepped into the California morning, fog lifting, sunlight breaking through the haze, and walked toward her old Honda. The doors of the courthouse eased shut behind her, and with that, just like that, the noise fell away. Sarah Dalton stepped into the gray California morning as though she'd simply finished a dental appointment, not just shattered an entire courtroom's perception of what a hero looks like. The marine fog clung to the windshield of her weathered Honda Civic, and gulls circled overhead, their calls rising above the low hum of harbor traffic. Behind her, the courthouse was still reeling. People were talking, whispers, questions, disbelief. But Sarah didn't need to hear any of it. She had no interest in the apologies that might come later. No use for the sudden reverence that came after a uniformed man had reminded everyone of what she had done 13 years ago, in a place the government still wouldn't officially admit they'd ever been. The truth, she didn't want any of it. She didn't want recognition. She didn't want the attention. She just wanted to go home. She slid into the driver's seat of her car. The interior smelled faintly of salt and old coffee. She placed the manila envelope on the passenger seat, its contents now more symbolic than necessary. Documents meant to prove she still existed, that she still had the right to be housed and helped, even if the system had tried to forget her. Her fingers hovered over the ignition. For a second, she stared out across the parking lot. the same cracked pavement she'd walked across earlier that morning with resignation in her steps. It already felt like a lifetime ago. The engine sputtered to life on the first try. That was rare. She pulled out, turning onto the main road, past the truck route, past the broken meters and the rust-stained courthouse walls. The Civic's tires hummed against the asphalt as she merged onto Highway 101, heading south, back toward Monterey Bay, back toward solitude, back toward her world. Sarah's home wasn't much, but it was hers. A converted shipping container tucked behind a eucalyptus grove on a friend's rural property. Inside, a mattress on a wooden frame, a shelf of dog-eared books, a coffee pot that leaked from one corner, and a small window facing the dunes. No TV, no neighbors, just ocean wind and the occasional owl. Rent was $200 a month, paid in cash. Nobody asked questions. Nobody tried to talk about what she used to be. Nobody flinched when she woke up screaming or when she went silent for days. It was quiet. And that quiet had become the most valuable thing in her life. As the highway curved along the coastline, the fog began to lift. Patches of blue appeared overhead, and the Pacific glinted faintly in the gaps between cypress trees. Sarah kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on her leg, still, calm, deliberate. The way she moved, the way she breathed, it all carried the rhythm of someone trained to endure, not to complain. She didn't replay the courtroom in her mind. She didn't need to. It was already drifting away, just another mission complete. A situation diffused. A target neutralized, not with bullets this time, but with truth. Thorne had done what he could. He always had. Even back then, he'd been one of the few officers who looked at snipers not just as tools, but as people. She'd appreciated his words, but she hadn't needed them. What mattered was that she could return to her life without a court record, without handcuffs, without shame. She hadn't asked for validation. She had only asked to be seen, and that was what most people never understood, what they still didn't. Sarah didn't want to be a symbol. She didn't want a podium or a documentary or a flag-draped ceremony. She didn't want to explain herself to people who wouldn't know what it meant to wait motionless in the dark for hours, breathing through pain and gravel dust, because 43 men depended on her not flinching. What she wanted was to finish her paperwork, to keep her benefits, to stay in her shipping container near the sea, and to be left alone. By the time she crested the last hill before the bay, the courthouse was long gone in the rear view. The radio played something soft, an old country song drifting in and out with the signal, and the sky had cleared just enough for sunlight to warm the dashboard. The manila envelope slid slightly on the seat with each curve of the road. She reached over, pressing it flat with her hand. Proof, she thought. That's all this is. Proof that I still count. She pulled into the gravel driveway beside the container, the tires crunching beneath her. The wind carried the sharp, briny scent of low tide, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then stopped. She stepped out and stood still for a moment. Then, without drama or hesitation, she went inside and closed the door. No headlines, no salute, no one watching. Just Sarah Dalton, Overwatch 7, home again. Exactly how she liked it. Sarah Dalton had almost reached her car when she heard footsteps behind her, light, hesitant. Not the stump of a bailiff or the click of dress shoes. She turned slightly. It was a young man, early 20s, hair a little too neat for a courthouse clerk, shirt tucked in like it was his first government job, and he was still trying hard not to mess it up. His eyes darted toward hers, then down to the ground, then back again. He held out a small white card with both hands, like it weighed more than it should. Mum. His voice cracked slightly. My mom works at the regional VA office in Oakland. She's been there a long time. Sarah didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The young man took a breath. I told her what happened just now. I texted her. She said to tell you thank you. He looked like he wanted to say more, like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to salute or apologize or both. But all he did was hold out the card, arm trembling ever so slightly. Sarah took it gently. Her fingers brushed his. She glanced down. No rank, no title, just a name and a number, hand written in blue ink on the back. If you ever need help, VA Priority Desk. Ask for Colleen. Sarah met his gaze, and for the first time that day, maybe the first time in a long while, she smiled. Not the practiced, polite curve of lips that veterans offer to get through conversations. A real one, quiet, warm, human. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. The clerk nodded quickly and backed away, like he'd just delivered a medal and didn't want to intrude any further. She turned back toward her car. From the top of the courthouse steps, Rear Admiral Benjamin Thorne stood watching. He hadn't moved since she left the holding area. He hadn't chased after her, hadn't tried to stop her for a handshake or a final word. Because he knew, people like Sarah didn't need grand farewells. They didn't need praise. They needed space. Still, as the old Honda pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, he felt a weight in his chest. Not guilt exactly, but something close. Regret, maybe. Regret that she'd had to walk through a door in handcuffs just to remind the world she was still here. His junior officers stood behind him, quiet and stiff. They weren't sure if they should speak. The courtroom had mostly emptied out, though a few clerks still stood in corners, processing what they'd seen, whispering as if afraid the walls might overhear. Thorne reached up and placed his cap back on his head. The brim cast a sharp shadow across his weathered face. One of the lieutenants finally asked, "Sir, should we follow her? Make sure she has everything she needs." Thorne didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down the street where her car had disappeared around the corner, taillights swallowed by morning fog. "She's been taking care of herself for over a decade," he said finally. "She doesn't need us to start now." The lieutenant nodded slowly, still unsure. Thorne turned one foot on the top step, then paused. "But maybe," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else, "maybe we need to start remembering something." His voice was calm, but it carried. Heroes don't always look like what we expect. The rest of the day at the courthouse continued, technically. The judge returned to his bench, though he barely raised his voice above a whisper now. The clerks filed paperwork. Lawyers whispered to clients. But the atmosphere had shifted. Like someone had cracked a window and let in the cold truth, because it wasn't just that Sarah Dalton had been forgotten. It was that no one had thought to ask if someone like her could still exist. Outside a record, beyond a uniform, walking quietly among civilians. The woman in worn jeans and a black hoodie hadn't looked like a sniper. She hadn't looked like a Navy Cross recipient. She hadn't looked like a Tier 1 operator who'd guided 43 lives out of a war zone with nothing but a crushed radio and her own will to stay conscious. She had just looked tired. And that, perhaps, was the lesson. Somewhere along Highway 101, the Honda hummed down a coastal stretch of road where fog hugged the hills. The ocean glimmered behind layers of mist, and the wind swept low across the dunes. Sarah drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting gently on the manila envelope now lying still beside her. The business card from the young clerk was tucked safely inside. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Behind her was a courthouse still reeling, a system briefly awakened from its own machinery. Ahead of her was the road home. Quiet, familiar, unglorified. Just the way she liked it. And beneath the fabric of her left sleeve, the 9 small marks remained, etched into her skin. Yes, but also into history, even if only a few would ever know it. 9 reminders. 9 lives taken to protect so many more. 9 reasons why sometimes silence isn't absence. It's discipline, it's strength, it's survival. Some people walk through our lives so quietly, we barely notice them. They sit at the DMV in courtrooms on worn benches at the VA. They wear old jeans and hoodies. They look tired, maybe distracted, and we assume we know who they are. Just another name on a list, another face in the crowd. But the truth, we have no idea who they are. We don't know what they've survived. We don't know what they've sacrificed. We don't know what they carry, beneath their sleeves, behind their eyes, and deep in their bones. Sarah Dalton didn't ask for praise. She didn't tell her story. She didn't correct anyone. She walked into a courthouse just to file a form, and she was handcuffed like she didn't matter, until someone noticed the 9 marks burned into her arm. 9 confirmed kills, 1 broken radio. 40, 3 lives saved. And still, all she wanted was peace. How many heroes are sitting next to us, quietly waiting, simply hoping to be treated like human beings? How many do we overlook, dismiss, or judge, because we're too rushed, too cynical, or too certain we've seen it all? We don't need to know someone's past to treat them with dignity. We don't need to see their medals to respect their silence. We just need to remember not all heroes look like heroes. Have you ever made a wrong assumption about someone, only to later realize you never really knew their story? What would change if we all asked, "Who are you really?" Before we judge, leave a comment. Start the conversation. Someone might need to hear it. If you believe real heroes walk quietly among us, if you believe dignity matters more than appearances, if you believe some stories deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button, because the people who shape this world aren't always on stage. Sometimes, they're just trying to make it through the day, one quiet mile at a time.